He woke each morning at the same time, not because he needed to, but because control had become the architecture of his life. The apartment responded to him silently. Lights adjusted themselves, coffee brewed without request, glass walls revealed a city that looked orderly from this height. Every surface was clean, every object placed with intention, as though disorder itself had been negotiated out of existence. Success had rewarded him with quiet, but the quiet had grown heavier over the years, settling into his chest in a way that no achievement seemed able to dislodge. His wealth was visible only in implication. There were no loud symbols, no excess meant to impress. He had long outgrown the need to prove anything. The boardrooms knew his name, the markets responded to his decisions, and his calendar was filled months in advance with obligations that required precision rather than presence. People around him described his life as enviable, stable, complete. He had learned to nod politely when they did, because correcting them would have required words he did not have. Infertility had entered his life quietly, announced in measured tones by doctors who spoke of probabilities and options. At first, it had seemed like another problem to solve, something that could be addressed with time, money, and persistence. When solutions failed, the language changed. Hope became expectation management. Certainty dissolved into suggestion. He and his wife navigated those years with disciplined optimism, attending appointments as if they were business meetings, reviewing results with professional calm. What neither of them acknowledged was the way disappointment accumulated, not dramatically, but incrementally, eroding something unnamed between them. Their marriage did not collapse in a single moment. It thinned. Conversations shortened. Touch became rare and cautious, as if either of them might bruise the other by accident. Eventually, they agreed on distance without formalizing it as loss. She left with grace, taking with her the possibility of a shared future that neither of them had known how to mourn. He stayed behind with a house that remained too large, its rooms echoing with a silence that no amount of careful living could fill. In the years that followed, he refined his routines. Work became his primary language, a place where effort reliably translated into outcome. He learned to measure his worth through quarterly results and long-term projections. Emotional restraint was not something he practiced consciously. It was simply how he functioned. Vulnerability felt inefficient, unpredictable. Grief, when it surfaced, did so in muted forms. A tightness behind the eyes during long flights, a restlessness late at night when the city lights dimmed and distractions lost their power. He avoided children without admitting it to himself. Friends noticed his absence from family gatherings, from celebrations that revolved around births and milestones. He sent gifts instead, generous and impersonal, believing that distance was a form of respect. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. Children represented a life path that had closed to him, and proximity threatened the careful equilibrium he had built around that fact. The idea of visiting an orphanage did not arrive as a revelation. It emerged gradually, during a meeting with advisors who framed it as a philanthropic consideration. Adoption was mentioned as one possibility among many, another way to direct resources toward something meaningful. He did not respond immediately. He took the information home, let it sit in his mind alongside other unfinished thoughts. Days passed, then weeks. The idea remained, not insistent, but present. He told himself that the visit would be informational. He was not making promises, not committing to anything. Framing it this way allowed him to approach the decision with the same measured caution he applied to investments. Yet beneath that rational structure, something less controlled stirred. The prospect unsettled him in ways he could not quantify. It suggested a confrontation not with logistics, but with absence itself. On the morning of the visit, he dressed as he always did, choosing neutral colors that blended authority with restraint. The car waited downstairs, the driver offering a polite greeting that required no response. As they moved through the city, familiar landmarks gave way to neighborhoods he rarely entered. The buildings grew closer together, the streets less polished. He watched from behind tinted glass, aware of his distance from the lives unfolding outside. He tried to recall what he expected to feel. Curiosity, perhaps. Responsibility. Instead, there was a quiet tension, a sense of being unprepared despite years of preparation for everything else. His hands rested loosely in his lap, fingers interlaced, a posture he used when waiting for outcomes he could not influence. He reminded himself that he could leave at any time. Nothing obligated him beyond the visit itself. The orphanage stood on a modest street, its exterior unremarkable. There were no banners, no attempts at presentation. Just a building that existed for a purpose, its walls worn but maintained. As the car stopped, he hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The air outside carried unfamiliar sounds. Distant laughter, the scrape of wheels on pavement, voices overlapping without clear hierarchy. It was not chaos, but it was alive in a way his own spaces were not. He paused at the entrance, straightening his jacket, drawing a steady breath. This was not a beginning, he told himself. It was an assessment. Still, as he stepped inside, he felt the subtle shift of crossing into a place where outcomes could not be controlled by contracts or capital. The absence he had learned to live with did not retreat here. It followed him in, waiting to be acknowledged. By the time a staff member approached to greet him, his composure had returned. He listened, nodded, followed instructions. From the outside, he appeared exactly as he always had. Capable, contained, unmoved. Inside, something had already begun to loosen, not painfully, but persistently. He did not yet know what he would do with that feeling. He only knew that avoiding it was no longer an option. The first thing that unsettled him was the sound. It was not loud, but it was layered, uncontained. Footsteps moved without pattern. Voices overlapped. Laughter rose and fell without warning. In his own buildings, sound obeyed rules. It was filtered, managed, absorbed by soft surfaces and distance. Here, it moved freely, brushing against him as soon as he stepped fully inside. The door closed behind him with a dull finality, and for a brief moment he felt as though he had crossed into a place that did not recognize the language of control he had spent his life mastering. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and something warmer beneath it, like food prepared earlier and carried through the air by time. The walls were clean but imperfect, marked by years of use rather than neglect. Children's artwork hung in uneven rows, bright colors pressed onto paper without concern for symmetry. He found himself slowing his pace, unsure where to look without seeming intrusive. In boardrooms, eye contact was currency. Here, it felt like trespass. A staff member greeted him with polite professionalism, her posture careful rather than deferential. She spoke calmly, explaining procedures, expectations, the purpose of the visit. He listened, nodding at appropriate intervals, but part of his attention drifted elsewhere, drawn to small movements at the edges of the room. A child rolled past in a wheelchair, wheels humming softly against the floor. Another sat cross-legged near a window, focused intently on a toy that appeared older than him. These moments registered not as scenes, but as interruptions to the mental distance he had hoped to maintain. He became acutely aware of his clothing. The tailored jacket, the polished shoes, the watch that reflected light too easily. None of it was ostentatious, yet it marked him unmistakably as an outsider. He was used to rooms adjusting themselves around his presence, conversations aligning with his expectations. Here, nothing shifted to accommodate him. Life continued in parallel, indifferent to his arrival. As he followed the staff member deeper into the building, he noticed the way others observed him. It was not curiosity alone, nor admiration. It was a measured attention shaped by experience. They had seen visitors like him before, he realized. People who arrived with resources, intentions, and assumptions. Some stayed briefly, others longer. All left some imprint, however small. The staff's caution was not suspicion, but restraint, a practiced balance between openness and protection. He felt an unexpected tightening in his chest when a child looked at him directly. The gaze was steady, unfiltered, devoid of the social calculations he encountered daily. There was no recognition of status, no curiosity about power, just presence. He looked away first, unsettled by the simplicity of it. In his world, being seen always meant being evaluated. Here, it meant something else, something he could not immediately define. The orphanage was not chaotic, but it was alive in ways that resisted containment. Schedules existed, routines were followed, yet emotion moved freely within those structures. He sensed it in the way a caregiver knelt to a child's level without checking the time, in the way a laugh lingered even after an activity ended. These were inefficiencies by corporate standards, but they carried a weight he could not dismiss. As they entered a common room, the contrast sharpened. The furniture was mismatched, chosen for durability rather than design. A television played quietly in the background, its volume low enough to coexist with conversation. He stood near the doorway, unsure where to place himself, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The staff member paused, offering him a seat, but he declined with a polite gesture. Standing felt safer, more temporary. He became conscious of his breathing, of the way his body reacted without instruction. A subtle tension settled into his shoulders, a readiness he associated with high-stakes negotiations. Yet there was nothing to negotiate here. No leverage to apply, no outcome to secure. The realization left him disoriented. For the first time in a long while, he was not the axis around which events turned. Staff members moved through the room with quiet efficiency, attending to needs as they arose. Their authority was gentle, rooted in familiarity rather than command. He watched as one adjusted a child's blanket, another mediated a disagreement with calm patience. These interactions were small, unremarkable on the surface, yet they carried an intimacy that felt foreign to him. He wondered how many times these gestures repeated each day, how often care was given without acknowledgement or reward. A flicker of defensiveness rose within him. He reminded himself why he was here. This was an exploration, not a surrender. He did not need to absorb every detail, did not need to feel everything. Yet the environment resisted his attempts at emotional distance. Vulnerability here was not hidden. It existed openly, not as spectacle but as fact. The staff member spoke again, describing the children, their routines, the supports in place. Her tone was factual, but beneath it lay a quiet advocacy. He recognized the skill in her words, the careful balance between transparency and respect. She did not soften realities, nor did she dramatize them. Listening, he felt the familiar urge to categorize, to assess feasibility, risk, outcome. The framework felt inadequate. He noticed that no one asked him questions beyond what was necessary. There were no attempts to impress him, no subtle appeals to his generosity. The absence of expectation unsettled him more than any direct request might have. It suggested that his presence, while noted, was not central. The orphanage existed independently of his decision, its purpose intact regardless of his involvement. As the visit continued, a quiet awareness settled over him. This was a place shaped by need, but not defined by deficiency. Strength here looked different from what he understood. It was not measured in expansion or profit, but in endurance, in the capacity to continue offering care without guarantees. He felt both humbled and displaced by that realization. When the staff member paused, allowing him a moment to absorb what he had seen, he nodded slowly. Words did not come easily. He was aware that something had shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The orphanage did not invite him in the way his world invited partners or investors. It simply existed, open but not accommodating. In that neutrality, he sensed the beginning of a reckoning. By the time they moved toward the next area, his discomfort had not eased, but it had changed. It no longer felt like intrusion alone. It felt like recognition of a boundary he had never needed to cross before. He did not belong here, and yet, for reasons he could not yet articulate, that fact no longer felt like a reason to leave. He noticed her only after the room had begun to settle into his awareness. At first, she was simply part of the periphery, a shape at the edge of movement, neither loud nor withdrawn enough to demand attention. While other children clustered near caregivers or drifted toward activities, she remained where she was, positioned slightly apart. Her wheelchair angled toward the window as if the outside world required less effort than participation inside. There was no isolation imposed on her. It was chosen, or at least accepted, with a composure that stood out precisely because it did not ask to be noticed. Light from the window traced the outline of her face, softening features that might otherwise have seemed guarded. She was not young enough to be fragile, nor old enough to be independent. Her posture was upright but relaxed, hands resting loosely in her lap. Nothing about her suggested waiting. She was simply present, attentive to the room without needing to insert herself into it. The man felt a subtle hesitation as his gaze lingered longer than he intended. He was accustomed to scanning spaces quickly, identifying points of relevance. This felt different. There was no obvious relevance, no immediate explanation for the pull. He told himself it was coincidence. A wheelchair drew attention, he reasoned, because it disrupted expectation. Yet the longer he observed, the less convincing that explanation became. Other children passed her without comment, some glancing briefly, others not at all. A caregiver checked on her with the same ease afforded to anyone else, adjusting something near the footrest before moving on. The girl responded with a small nod, efficient, self-contained. There was no performance of gratitude, no appeal for reassurance. He felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, not sharp enough to be pain, but insistent. It reminded him of moments when memory surfaced without warning, uninvited yet undeniable. He tried to redirect his attention to the staff member speaking beside him, to the practicalities being explained, but his focus kept drifting back. The girl's stillness contrasted sharply with the room's gentle motion. She was not disengaged. She was anchored. He wondered what stories others assigned to her in their minds. Pity, resilience, limitation, inspiration. He recognized the impulse because he had spent years categorizing risk and potential, reducing complexity to manageable narratives. Yet none of those frameworks fit her. She did not project struggle or triumph. She simply existed, complete in a way that resisted interpretation. The staff member continued her explanation, mentioning programs, accessibility, support structures. He listened, absorbing the information, but a question formed silently within him. It was not about logistics. It was about presence. Why did this particular child unsettle him when so many others did not? He felt faintly embarrassed by the question, as if acknowledging it granted it more power than it deserved. He shifted his stance slightly, the movement drawing the attention of a caregiver nearby. Their eyes met briefly, and he sensed an unspoken awareness. She followed his line of sight without comment, then returned to her task. There was no encouragement, no prompting. The neutrality was disarming. No one here seemed interested in guiding his emotions. Whatever he felt belonged to him alone. The girl turned her head, perhaps sensing his attention, perhaps simply adjusting to the light. Their eyes met. The moment was brief, unremarkable by any external measure. She did not smile. She did not look away quickly either. Her gaze was steady, assessing without curiosity. He felt a sudden awareness of himself as object rather than observer, a reversal that unsettled him more than he expected. In his world, people looked at him with expectation, calculation, deference. This was different. This was neutral recognition. He looked away first, a reflex he did not analyze until later. The realization that he had done so lingered, faintly troubling. He had not felt threatened, yet something in her gaze had pierced the distance he maintained so carefully. It had not demanded anything. It had simply existed alongside him, unafraid. As the visit progressed, he found himself measuring time by her presence. When she moved slightly, adjusting her position, he noticed. When a sound near her drew attention, his awareness followed. He did not approach her, did not signal interest. The restraint felt deliberate, as though proximity might disrupt something fragile, though he could not have said what. He began to reflect on absence in a new way. His own life had been shaped by what was missing, by the child he never had, the future that had quietly closed. He had learned to frame that absence as manageable, even dignified. Yet here, in this room, absence took on a different texture. It was not hidden. It was integrated. The girl's wheelchair was not an absence of movement, but a different form of it. Her position at the edge was not exclusion but choice. The staff member paused, giving him space to observe. He realized she had noticed his attention without commenting on it. The discretion felt intentional, a form of respect. He appreciated it more than he expected. It allowed him to remain with the feeling without needing to explain it away. He thought briefly of his former home, of rooms designed for potential that never materialized. He had filled those spaces with objects, with order, with silence. Here, space was shared differently. There was no room that belonged to one person alone. Even solitude existed within reach of others. The girl embodied that balance. Alone but not isolated. Independent but not abandoned. When the time came to move on, he felt a faint reluctance. It surprised him. He was not attached, not yet. But something about leaving her presence unresolved stirred discomfort. He reminded himself that this was not a decision point. He had not come here to respond to impulse. Still, as he followed the staff member toward the next area, he glanced back once more. The girl had returned her attention to the window. Whatever exchange had passed between them had not altered her posture or expression. She remained as she had been, self-contained, unremarkable to anyone not looking closely. That constancy struck him deeply. It suggested a strength he had rarely encountered, one that did not announce itself or seek validation. By the time he reached the hallway, the disturbance within him had settled into something quieter but more persistent. He did not yet understand its shape or purpose. He only knew that the girl at the edge of the room had shifted something internal, not by asking for anything, but by existing fully without explanation. The realization followed him, steady and unresolved, as the visit continued. He noticed her before he admitted that he had noticed her, a quiet awareness forming beneath his practiced composure. The room was alive with sound, children shifting, laughing, calling for attention, the staff moving with gentle authority through familiar chaos. His eyes had already scanned the space the way he approached everything, assessing scale, order, and efficiency, yet she resisted that process. She sat slightly apart, angled near the window where the light softened the dust in the air. Her wheelchair was unadorned, functional rather than symbolic, and her hands rested calmly in her lap as if she were waiting for nothing at all. The first judgment came automatically, almost professionally. He measured distance, access points, the height of door frames, the width of corridors. His mind assembled invisible spreadsheets of modifications and schedules. He noted the thinness of her arms, the careful way she balanced herself, and the subtle stillness that suggested endurance rather than fragility. These observations carried no malice, yet they tightened something in his chest. He was accustomed to problems that yielded to investment and planning. This was not one of them, and the uncertainty unsettled him. Around her, the other children moved in patterns shaped by attention and competition. They leaned forward when adults passed, their faces bright with rehearsed hope. She did neither. She watched without expectation, her gaze steady but unassertive, as though she understood the limits of interruption. That restraint disturbed him more than pleading ever could have. It felt like a boundary he had not been invited to cross, and boundaries had always been his domain. He told himself he was being practical. Adoption required foresight, stamina, resilience. He had built companies by anticipating failure before it arrived, and he applied the same logic here. The needs would be ongoing. The risks would not diminish with time. Responsibility, once assumed, would be permanent. These thoughts lined up neatly, each reinforcing the last, until they formed a wall he could lean against. It was safer to think this way, safer than allowing the faint pull he felt whenever his attention returned to her quiet presence. A staff member spoke nearby, explaining routines and resources, and he nodded at appropriate intervals. He listened, but his focus drifted back to the girl. She adjusted the blanket over her knees with a small, efficient movement, not looking to see if anyone noticed. The simplicity of the gesture carried an unexpected weight. It suggested self-reliance learned early, not as virtue but as necessity. He wondered how many times she had learned not to ask. His internal calculations began to fray. He imagined nights interrupted by medical concerns, mornings structured around care rather than convenience. The image clashed sharply with his current life, a world calibrated to precision and solitude. He felt an instinctive recoil, followed immediately by shame. The reaction was not about her condition, he realized, but about the exposure of his own limits. He had mastered control by avoiding situations that demanded emotional improvisation. This would demand nothing else. When she finally looked toward him, it was not curiosity that marked her expression, but acknowledgement. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment he felt seen in a way that bypassed status entirely. There was no appeal in her gaze, no challenge, only a calm recognition that unsettled him more deeply than judgment ever could. He broke eye contact first, irritated by his own vulnerability. He shifted his stance, grounding himself in familiar discomfort. Logic returned, sharper now, almost defensive. He reminded himself of the responsibility to choose wisely, to avoid decisions driven by sentiment. He framed his hesitation as ethical caution. A child deserved certainty, stability, someone unquestioningly capable. To doubt was to protect her, he told himself, even as the explanation rang hollow. The room seemed to slow around him. Conversations faded into background texture, and the light through the window grew warmer as the afternoon aged. He realized that his assessment had changed without permission. She was no longer an abstract challenge but a presence that had quietly entered his thoughts. The judgment he had formed began to feel less like discernment and more like retreat. He understood then that his fear was not of failing her, but of being changed by the attempt. The life he had built relied on emotional distance as much as discipline. To step closer would mean dismantling defenses he had mistaken for strength. This awareness did not soften his concern, but it reframed it. His silence was no longer neutral, carried weight, consequence, and intent. As the visit drew on, he remained outwardly composed. Yet something within him had shifted. The girl remained where she was, patient and unassuming, her presence steady rather than insistent. He did not move toward her, but he no longer looked away. In that balance between judgment and acknowledgement, he felt the first honest tension of responsibility, not as obligation but as choice. He left the room knowing his conclusions were unfinished, aware that his silence had already altered him. The assumptions he carried felt heavier now, no longer clean tools but blunt instruments shaped by fear. He recognized that capability was not measured only in readiness, and that avoidance could masquerade as care. The girl had not asked for anything, yet she had revealed something essential by remaining exactly as she was. His judgment softened into humility, a quiet admission that his fear of exposure had guided him longer than he wished to admit. As he stepped away, he carried no decision, only an unsettled respect for the weight of choosing, and the understanding that responsibility begins where certainty ends. This recognition settled slowly, neither accusation nor promise, but an honest pause that marked the beginning of change within him. He accepted that restraint itself had become a judgment requiring reconsideration at last quietly. The conversation unfolded without ceremony, introduced not as a revelation but as a continuation of the visit. He stood near a low shelf of toys while two caretakers spoke in measured tones, their words shaped by repetition rather than performance. They did not lower their voices for drama, nor did they raise them for emphasis. What they offered him was information refined by years of necessity, stripped of ornament and expectation. He sensed immediately that this was not a story meant to persuade, only one meant to be understood. They described the girl's mornings first, because mornings revealed the most. She woke early, not because she was restless, but because routine anchored her. She preferred to prepare herself as much as possible before assistance arrived, insisting on small tasks that others might rush through for her sake. This insistence was not framed as bravery or independence, merely as habit. He felt a flicker of discomfort at how easily he had imagined her days as defined by waiting. The caretakers spoke of her history with restraint, careful not to compress it into a narrative of loss. They mentioned the accident only once, without lingering detail, as if naming it was sufficient. What followed mattered more. The adjustments that came after, the periods of frustration that settled into patience, the slow rebuilding of confidence through repetition rather than encouragement. Their language resisted tragedy. It was factual, even procedural, and that steadiness unsettled him more than sorrow would have. He listened closely, aware that he was being observed as much as he was observing. The caretaker's eyes returned to him periodically, not searching for approval but gauging comprehension. They spoke of the girl's preferences, her dislike for unnecessary fuss, her quiet humor that surfaced unexpectedly, often when others least anticipated it. These details did not soften her condition. They contextualized it. He realized how rarely he allowed complexity to exist without categorizing it. They described her daily routines in practical terms, how she navigated spaces with familiarity rather than caution. She knew which thresholds required assistance and which did not, where to pause and where to proceed without help. This knowledge, they emphasized, came from consistency, not supervision. He felt the shape of his assumptions shifting, the idea of dependency loosening under the weight of lived detail. One caretaker mentioned that the girl rarely asked for accommodations directly. Instead, she adapted quietly, often before anyone noticed the need. This was not presented as virtue, but as observation. He found himself unsettled by the neutrality of it all. There was no attempt to frame her resilience as inspirational, no invitation to admiration. The absence of sentiment forced him to confront her reality without the buffer of narrative comfort. As they spoke, his thoughts returned to his earlier evaluations. He had imagined her future as a series of limitations, each requiring mitigation. Now, he was presented with a present shaped by management rather than deficiency. The distinction mattered. It suggested that strength was not the absence of need, but the understanding of it. This realization did not erase his concerns, but it altered their weight. The caretakers addressed his questions before he asked them, anticipating the unspoken calculations behind his silence. They acknowledged the demands of care without dramatizing them, outlining what consistency required rather than what it cost. Their transparency felt deliberate, almost corrective. They were not shielding him from difficulty, nor were they magnifying it. They trusted the clarity of reality to speak for itself. He noticed how often they returned to the word routine. Routine was not framed as confinement, but as freedom earned through predictability. The girl thrived within structures that others might find restrictive. He understood this language instinctively. His own life was built upon it. Yet he had never considered routine as an act of care rather than control. As the conversation deepened, he sensed the quiet recalibration happening within him. The caretakers did not challenge his authority or question his capability. They did something more disarming. They treated him as someone who needed to listen before deciding. Their calm assumed his seriousness without flattering it. In that space, he felt less like a benefactor and more like a participant in a shared responsibility. They spoke of setbacks without apology, moments when frustration resurfaced, when patience thinned. These were described not as failures, but as expected fluctuations. He recognized the language of sustainability, the same language he used in boardrooms when discussing long-term projects. The parallel unsettled him. He had always separated emotional commitment from strategic endurance. Here they overlapped. The girl herself remained in the background as they spoke, her presence steady rather than central. She was not summoned or presented. This choice felt intentional. Her life was not a demonstration. He felt a growing respect for the way she was protected not by secrecy, but by normalcy. It forced him to confront how often protection was confused with concealment. By the time the caretakers finished, the room felt altered. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet the atmosphere carried a new density. His assumptions had not been overturned by argument, but eroded by familiarity. He realized that his earlier fear of inadequacy had been shaped by distance. Proximity, even through description, had softened it into something more manageable. He thanked them, aware that gratitude was insufficient but appropriate. As he stepped away, he carried with him a revised understanding of care, one rooted not in capability alone but in commitment sustained over time. The girl's life, as they had described it, was not defined by what she could not do, but by what she did daily, quietly, without spectacle. This knowledge did not resolve his hesitation, but it grounded it. He felt less inclined to judge and more compelled to understand. The caretakers had not offered reassurance. They had offered reality. In accepting it, he felt a subtle shift from evaluation toward responsibility. The weight of that shift settled calmly, without urgency, leaving him with a clearer sense of what strength looked like when stripped of myth. The room he stepped into afterward was smaller and quieter, but it carried more weight than the larger hall had. It was not designated for reflection, yet it invited it all the same. A narrow window let in muted afternoon light, softened by dust and age, and the air held a faint medicinal scent that stirred something uninvited in him. He remained standing at first, as if movement might keep memory at bay, but stillness proved more insistent. Without warning, images surfaced with unsettling clarity. White corridors stretched endlessly, their walls too clean, their silence punctuated only by distant footsteps and the hum of machines. He remembered the way medical rooms were designed to feel neutral, as if color itself might provoke false hope. He had once believed that discipline and preparation could make such spaces manageable. Time had taught him otherwise. The orphanage had not triggered these memories deliberately, yet its unpolished vulnerability mirrored something familiar. It was the absence of pretense that unsettled him. In clinics, emotions were regulated by protocol. Here, they were simply present. He found himself recalling the countless appointments that had once structured his life, each promising clarity, each delivering ambiguity. The language of medicine had been precise, but the outcomes had remained stubbornly undefined. He remembered how he and his wife had learned to listen for words not spoken, how pauses grew heavier than explanations, how hope had become a careful thing rationed and measured. Their conversations during that time had been economical, not because they lacked feeling, but because feeling threatened to overwhelm function. Control had become their shared strategy, a way to survive disappointment without naming it. As these memories resurfaced, he noticed how instinctively he still relied on the same defenses. His success, his routines, his authority had all been constructed to create distance from unpredictability. He had mistaken stability for healing. The orphanage disrupted that illusion, not by confronting him, but by existing without the safeguards he had come to depend on. He thought of the girl again, not as an image but as a presence. Her quiet steadiness contrasted sharply with his own internal unrest. He had assumed that years of managing loss had fortified him. Instead, he recognized how carefully he had compartmentalized pain, sealing it behind productivity and order. The realization did not arrive as a revelation, but as an acknowledgement long delayed. Memories of his wife surfaced next, less sharply but with greater emotional density. He recalled how they had once shared a language of anticipation, how their plans had been structured around a future that slowly narrowed. When treatments failed, they had not argued or collapsed. They had simply grown quieter. Loss had not arrived as an event, but as an erosion. The orphanage, with its visible imperfections, reminded him of what they had lost without ceremony. There had been no moment of reckoning, no dramatic acceptance, only a gradual shift toward lives that no longer included certain conversations. Even after her passing, he had maintained the routines they once shared, as if repetition could preserve meaning. He realized now how deeply that habit was rooted in fear. He sat down at last, allowing the stillness to take hold. The chair beneath him creaked slightly, grounding him in the present. His reflection was not self-indulgent. It felt necessary, unavoidable. The orphanage had not accused him of anything, yet it had revealed the cost of emotional containment. He had spent years managing disappointment by minimizing expectation. In doing so, he had also minimized possibility. The memory of failed treatments lingered, not as pain, but as residue. He remembered how every attempt had been framed as a step forward, even when results suggested otherwise. He had learned to interpret neutrality as encouragement. Now, faced with a different kind of uncertainty, he recognized the same pattern emerging. His hesitation toward the girl was not rooted in her condition, but in his fear of reopening a chapter he had sealed shut. He understood then that his control had never been about mastery. It had been about avoidance. The orphanage, by contrast, existed in a state of ongoing adaptation. There was no illusion of permanence, only continuity shaped by care. This difference unsettled him, forcing him to reconsider the narratives he had built around resilience and success. The room seemed to hold his thoughts without judgment. Outside, he could hear distant movement, the sound of children navigating space without concern for silence. That sound carried a weight he had not anticipated. It reminded him that life persisted not through certainty, but through engagement. The orphanage did not promise resolution. It demanded presence. As he prepared to leave the room, he felt a subtle shift within himself. The memories that had resurfaced did not overwhelm him, nor did they recede. They settled into a new configuration, less compartmentalized, more integrated. He recognized that his past had shaped him not only through loss, but through the choices he had made to survive it. Stepping back into the larger space, he carried this awareness with him. The orphanage was no longer just a setting. It had become a mirror. It reflected the wounds he had believed were contained, revealing how closely they still guided his decisions. This recognition did not weaken him, clarified him. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of engaging with uncertainty without retreating into control. The weight of his past remained, but it no longer demanded isolation. In acknowledging it, he sensed the beginnings of a different kind of strength, one that allowed room for connection without the guarantee of outcome. She was accustomed to being observed without being seen. The girl had learned early how to occupy space quietly, not as retreat but as calibration. In rooms filled with motion and sound, she positioned herself where activity passed around rather than through her. This was not resignation. It was strategy. From her wheelchair, she understood angles, distances, the subtle rhythms of people moving with bodies that did not require forethought. Awareness had become her first language. Her days were structured by routines that others mistook for limitation. She knew the timing of doors, the texture of floors, the slight resistance in ramps that revealed whether they had been repaired recently or merely repainted. These details anchored her. They were not symbols of hardship but evidence of attention. Where others moved instinctively, she moved deliberately, and in that deliberation she found a form of agency that required no announcement. She had learned patience not as virtue, but as necessity. Waiting did not irritate her because waiting was not empty. It was filled with observation. She noticed when caregivers were tired before they admitted it. She recognized which children were loud because they were confident and which because silence frightened them. Her stillness allowed her to read these differences without intrusion. Emotional literacy, she had discovered, did not require mobility. Independence, for her, did not resemble the kind celebrated in brochures or speeches. It was quieter, more negotiated. She asked for help when needed, not as concession but as coordination. She understood her capabilities clearly and did not apologize for the boundaries they imposed. This clarity unsettled adults more than visible struggle ever could. They expected longing or frustration. Instead, they encountered steadiness. When the man noticed her again, it was not because she had moved, but because she had not. Amid the ambient noise of the orphanage, her presence registered as a pause rather than an interruption. She existed without performance. There was no appeal in her posture, no invitation to pity or admiration. This absence of narrative disarmed him. He was accustomed to stories that justified attention. She offered none. Her internal world was not untouched by difficulty. She knew loss, though she framed it differently. While others mourned what might have been, she focused on what remained consistent. The chair was not an enemy to be overcome, but a companion to be understood. She had learned its sounds, its vulnerabilities. In caring for it, she cared for herself. This mutual adaptation had shaped her sense of responsibility early. Emotionally, she carried herself with an evenness that surprised those who assumed fragility. She experienced disappointment, but she did not dwell in it. Dwelling, she had learned, consumed energy better used elsewhere. Instead, she practiced a form of acceptance that was active rather than passive. She adjusted expectations without diminishing desire. This balance was not taught. It was earned through repetition. The man, observing her from across the room, found this steadiness disconcerting. He had prepared himself to confront suffering, to manage his response to visible pain. What he encountered instead was composure without detachment. Her calm was not numbness. It was attentiveness refined by necessity. This distinction unsettled him because it mirrored something he had long avoided acknowledging. That strength did not always announce itself through effort. She noticed him as well, not with curiosity but with recognition. She had seen his type before, though not often. Adults who carried authority in their posture but uncertainty in their eyes. They tended to speak carefully, as if language itself required negotiation. She did not speculate about his intentions. Speculation, she had learned, often led to disappointment. Instead, she registered his presence and returned to her own rhythm. Her sense of self was not constructed in opposition to her condition. It existed alongside it, neither defined nor erased by it. She did not imagine a version of herself without the chair because imagination, for her, was reserved for futures she could inhabit. This practicality was often mistaken for limitation, but it was, in truth, a form of respect for reality. She refused to romanticize struggle or deny it. Both felt equally dishonest. As the man continued to watch, he became aware of his own internal agitation. Her ease exposed the tension he carried, the vigilance that had become habitual. He realized that he associated resilience with visible effort, with narratives of overcoming. Her way of existing disrupted that framework. She was not overcoming anything. She was living within it. This realization challenged his assumptions about worth and readiness. The girl's emotional steadiness did not stem from isolation. It was shaped by connection, though not the kind he expected. She relied on consistency, on relationships that respected her autonomy. She valued those who adjusted without announcement, who offered assistance without obligation. This discernment had sharpened her sense of trust. She did not extend it easily, but when she did, it was deliberate. In this moment, she required nothing from him. This absence of demand unsettled him further. He was accustomed to being needed, to solving problems that validated his presence. Her self-sufficiency offered no such reinforcement. Instead, it asked him to confront his own motivations without distraction. He recognized that his discomfort did not arise from her limitations, but from his inability to situate himself within her reality. As the chapter of observation closed, both remained where they were, unchanged in position yet altered in perception. The girl continued to exist as she always had, grounded in awareness and adaptation. The man, however, carried away a quiet disturbance, one that lingered not as guilt but as reconsideration. Her way of existing had not demanded his attention, yet it had claimed it all the same. In that shared space, without exchange or declaration, something subtle shifted. He began to understand that emotional steadiness could be more unsettling than visible suffering because it left no room for distance. It required presence, not solutions. And in recognizing this, he sensed the gradual loosening of the defenses he had built, making room for a different kind of engagement, one rooted not in control but in acknowledgement. The thought of leaving arrived quietly, without drama or urgency. It settled into the millionaire's mind the way fatigue does after a long day, unannounced, but insistent. He stood near the edge of the room, hands loosely folded, posture composed in the way years of boardrooms had trained him. Outwardly, nothing suggested indecision. Inwardly, however, a subtle resistance began to take shape, not toward the girl herself, but toward the meaning he was starting to assign to his presence there. He questioned whether what he felt was interest or displacement, whether the pull he experienced was readiness or simply the unfamiliar discomfort of being somewhere his usual defenses did not apply. For most of his life, decisions had followed logic, reinforced by data, vetted by advisors. This choice resisted that framework. It asked something less measurable. That unsettled him. Withdrawal, he realized, might restore the clarity he was accustomed to. He watched staff members move through the space with quiet efficiency. There was no shift in their behavior toward him as his attention wavered. No encouragement appeared in their expressions. No subtle cues designed to anchor him. This absence felt deliberate. They neither closed distance nor created it. Their neutrality carried weight. It suggested that his presence was welcome, but not required. The orphanage would continue whether he stayed or not. One of the caregivers paused near him briefly, not to engage but to adjust a chair left slightly out of place. The action was practical, unremarkable, yet it underscored something he had begun to sense since arriving. No one here was waiting to be saved. The structure existed to support, not to appeal. The children were not arranged as possibilities, nor were visitors treated as benefactors. This balance challenged his assumptions more than overt resistance would have. As he considered leaving, he became aware of how familiar that impulse was. Retreat had long been his preferred response to emotional uncertainty. When medical interventions failed, he had turned to work. When grief threatened to surface, he had reorganized his life around predictability. Withdrawal had preserved function, but it had also narrowed his world. Standing there now, he recognized the pattern without fully understanding how to interrupt it. The staff's restraint felt almost instructional. They did not ask him what he was thinking, nor did they offer reassurance. In their silence was an implicit acknowledgement that adoption was not an answer to longing, but a commitment that required clarity. This was not a place where hesitation was seen as weakness. It was treated as part of the process. That perspective both relieved and burdened him. He realized that no one was framing this as an opportunity for redemption. There were no narratives of transformation offered, no subtle promises of fulfillment. The choice was presented plainly, stripped of sentiment. Responsibility, not rescue. Continuity, not compensation. This reframing unsettled him because it removed the illusion of heroism. If he stayed, it would not be because he was needed, but because he was willing. The girl remained where she had been, engaged in her own quiet rhythm. She did not look toward him as his attention wavered. There was no shift in her posture, no sign of anticipation. Her indifference to his internal struggle was not dismissive. It was simply factual. She had no reason to adjust herself in response to a decision that had not been made. This neutrality mirrored the staff's approach and reinforced the sense that his presence carried no special gravity. He felt the weight of that realization settle into his chest. For the first time, he confronted the possibility that his resources did not automatically confer relevance. That insight was not humiliating, but it was destabilizing. It forced him to consider his motivations without the buffer of appreciation or urgency. If he chose to leave, nothing would collapse. If he stayed, nothing would be guaranteed. As he imagined walking back into his controlled environment, the familiarity felt hollow. He could picture the silence of his home, the precision of his routines. Those structures had once provided comfort. Now they seemed insufficient. Yet the alternative, a commitment that could not be optimized or delegated, felt equally daunting. The resistance he felt was not rejection of the girl or the place. It was resistance to the exposure that came with choosing differently. A staff member finally addressed him, not with a question, but with a statement offered gently and without emphasis. There was no appeal embedded in it, only information about next steps should he wish to continue. The tone conveyed trust in his ability to decide without influence. That trust carried more moral weight than persuasion ever could. It implied accountability rather than obligation. He nodded, acknowledging the information without responding immediately. The absence of pressure created space for honesty. In that space, he recognized that his hesitation was not confusion, but fear. Fear of inadequacy, of permanence, of stepping into a role that could not be exited quietly. The orphanage, in its restraint, had stripped the decision of spectacle and left him alone with its consequences. As he prepared to leave the room, the thought of departure no longer felt like escape. It felt like postponement. He understood that leaving now would not resolve the questions that had surfaced. They would follow him uncontained. The staff's refusal to frame his choice as urgent had, paradoxically, made it unavoidable. He could walk away physically, but the moral weight would remain. He took one last look at the space, not searching for affirmation, but acknowledging what had been revealed. This was not a place that needed him to be decisive in order to function. It was a place that required him to be honest if he chose to return. That distinction lingered as he stepped toward the exit. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with clarity. He had not committed, nor had he withdrawn fully. Instead, he carried with him an understanding that the decision ahead was not about filling absence, but about accepting responsibility without illusion. In that recognition, something shifted. The resistance remained, but it was no longer a barrier. It had become part of the process, shaping a choice that would need to be made with intention rather than impulse. The room had settled into a late afternoon hush, the kind that follows prolonged attention and quiet decisions. The millionaire remained near the window, no longer measuring exits or possibilities, simply present within the space. The orphanage felt different now, less intrusive, less like a challenge to be managed. Light moved slowly across the floor, revealing scuffs and where that spoke of long use rather than neglect. In that stillness, his thoughts slowed. The urgency to define his role softened, replaced by a gentler awareness of time passing without demand or expectation. He noticed the girl approach without announcement, her movement deliberate but unremarkable, as if navigating the room were an extension of her breathing. She positioned herself nearby, not intruding, not retreating. There was no request in her posture. The chair beneath her creaked faintly, a practical sound that grounded the moment. He did not straighten or prepare himself. For once, he did not feel observed or evaluated. The interaction unfolded without witnesses assigning meaning, without the weight of consequence pressing in from the edges. They did not speak. The absence of words did not create discomfort, only clarity. He became aware of the simple fact of sharing space with someone who did not require anything from him. The girl's attention seemed directed inward, her gaze resting somewhere beyond the window, perhaps following a memory or thought he could not access. Her calm did not signal detachment. It reflected familiarity with stillness, with moments that did not need to be filled to matter. He felt something loosen within him, a subtle release of the instinct to assess and respond. In his world, silence often demanded resolution, a next step. Here, silence existed as its own form of acknowledgement. The girl's presence did not highlight his uncertainty. It rendered it irrelevant. He realized that connection could occur without negotiation, without explanation. It could exist quietly, sustained by mutual recognition rather than exchange. The orphanage noises continued faintly around them, distant laughter, a door closing, footsteps crossing a hallway. None of it disrupted the moment. The girl adjusted her position slightly, an everyday movement, and he mirrored it unconsciously by shifting his weight. The simplicity of that shared adjustment struck him. It suggested attunement rather than intervention, an awareness that did not seek to alter the other's state. He reflected on how often he had equated care with action, responsibility with control. This moment offered an alternative understanding. Care could mean allowing someone to remain as they were, without imposing narrative or solution. The girl did not present herself as incomplete. She existed fully within the present, unburdened by the need to justify her place. That realization unsettled him gently, like a truth recognized too late to ignore. The girl glanced toward him briefly, not to invite response, but to confirm presence. Their eyes met without intensity. There was no expectation exchanged, only acknowledgement. In that brief contact, he sensed respect rather than dependence. It was not the respect of hierarchy or gratitude, but something quieter, rooted in shared humanity. The recognition did not elevate him, steadied him. He became aware of how rarely he allowed himself to be seen without purpose. In business, visibility always carried function. Here, being seen carried none. The girl's glance did not assign him a role. It simply placed him within the same moment she occupied. That simplicity felt disarming. He understood then that his value in this interaction was not derived from what he could provide, but from his willingness to remain present. Time passed unnoticed. When the girl eventually turned her attention elsewhere, the moment did not fracture. It concluded naturally, without closure or signal. He did not feel dismissed. He felt included in something complete on its own terms. The encounter left no residue of obligation, only a quiet imprint of understanding. As she moved away, he remained still, absorbing the shift within himself. The urge to fix, to decide, to act immediately had receded. In its place was a clearer sense of what connection could look like when stripped of performance. He recognized that saving had never been the requirement. Presence had been enough. The chapter closed with him standing alone again, yet altered. The room felt less like a threshold and more like a shared environment he could enter honestly. The moment had not resolved his choice, but it had reframed it. He carried forward the understanding that connection did not demand rescue, only recognition, and that realization settled into him with quiet certainty. The quiet that followed lingered longer than he expected. After the girl moved away, the room did not rush to fill the space she left behind. Instead, it seemed to hold its breath, as if allowing him time he had not asked for but deeply needed. He stepped into an empty corridor nearby, guided more by instinct than intention. The walls were painted a tired neutral, marked by years of hands brushing past, by small lives passing through without permanence. The air carried a faint scent of disinfectant mixed with something warmer, perhaps soap or cooked rice from the kitchen. It was an ordinary place, and that ordinariness unsettled him more than grandeur ever could. He rested his palm against the wall, surprised by the slight tremor in his fingers. His body reacted before his thoughts could intervene. For most of his life, emotion had been something to anticipate and manage, never something allowed to arrive unannounced. Yet here it was, pressing forward without permission. He closed his eyes, and with that small act, the structure he relied on began to soften. The corridor did not demand composure. There were no observers to impress, no consequences to calculate. Memories surfaced not as sharp flashes but as slow, heavy waves. Hospital rooms came first, their clinical lighting and restrained voices. He remembered the careful phrasing of doctors, the polite sympathy that never quite masked finality. Years of appointments, charts, probabilities, and quiet car rides home followed. He recalled how he had learned to keep his face still, how he had trained himself to interpret disappointment as data rather than loss. Infertility had become a condition to be managed, not a grief to be acknowledged. In mastering that discipline, he had believed himself strong. But strength, he realized now, had become a barrier. It had allowed him to survive but not to feel. The realization settled heavily in his chest. He saw how control had shaped his days, how routines and success had replaced vulnerability. Even his decision to come here had been framed as a measured experiment rather than an emotional risk. He had approached the orphanage as one might approach a negotiation, prepared to withdraw if the cost felt too high. The girl's quiet presence disrupted that framework. She had not asked him to confront his past, yet she had made avoidance impossible. Her steadiness reflected something he had long lacked, the courage to exist without armor. In recognizing that, something inside him gave way. His breathing faltered, uneven and shallow at first. He leaned more heavily against the wall, as though the building itself might lend support. The tears arrived without drama. There was no sobbing, no collapse. Instead, his face tightened, and moisture blurred his vision. The sensation startled him more than pain would have. He had not cried in years, not because he was incapable, but because he had convinced himself it was unnecessary. Now, the release felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. He did not try to stop it. For once, there was nothing to gain by restraint. As the tears fell, they carried with them a sense of surrender rather than despair. He mourned not only the child he never had, but the years spent denying himself the right to grieve. He recognized the cost of emotional distance, how it had protected him while also isolating him. In this narrow corridor, surrounded by the muted life of the orphanage. He allowed himself to feel the weight of that truth fully. The sound of his breathing steadied gradually. Each exhale seemed to loosen something held too tightly for too long. He was not breaking because he was weak. He was breaking because he could no longer maintain the illusion that avoidance equaled resilience. The realization did not humiliate him, clarified him. Vulnerability, he saw now, was not an absence of control but a different relationship with it. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, surprised by how grounding the simple gesture felt. The world did not change because he cried. The corridor remained the same. The orphanage continued its rhythms. Yet he felt altered, as if a locked room within him had finally been opened. The emotions he had stored there did not overwhelm him once acknowledged. They settled, heavy but manageable. He thought of the girl again, not with urgency, but with a quiet sense of gratitude. She had not caused this moment, but she had made it possible. Through her, he had glimpsed a way of being that did not demand perfection or certainty. The breakdown did not resolve his questions about adoption or readiness. It did something more essential. It reminded him that he was still capable of feeling deeply, honestly, without retreat. When he finally straightened, his posture felt different, less rigid. He took a slow breath, testing the steadiness of his voice, though he did not intend to speak. There was no need to explain himself to anyone. This moment belonged to him alone. The tears had not emptied him. They had cleared something, creating space for reflection rather than fear. As he stepped back toward the main room, his expression composed but softened, he carried with him a new awareness. The breaking point had not marked an end. It marked a release. He understood now that vulnerability was not a threat to his carefully built life, but a necessary counterweight. The chapter closed with him moving forward quietly, not healed, but more open than he had been in years, ready to consider what it might mean to live without constant defense. The decision did not arrive with clarity or relief. It emerged slowly, shaped by the quiet that followed his private reckoning. After returning to the common area, he did not rush to speak or seek confirmation. He observed instead. The orphanage moved around him with practiced calm, children passing through hallways, staff attending to routines that did not pause for personal milestones. The world here did not reorganize itself around intention. That, more than anything, tempered him. He noticed how the girl navigated the space with familiarity rather than expectation. Her wheelchair bore small signs of wear, softened handles, a wheel that hummed faintly when she turned. She was not waiting to be chosen. She was living within the boundaries she understood, adjusting to the day as it unfolded. The absence of performance unsettled him. In his world, decisions were announced, validated, recorded. Here, significance existed quietly, without witnesses. When a staff member approached him again, there was no ceremony. Paperwork rested on a clipboard, held loosely, as though it were an invitation rather than a contract. He listened carefully as procedures were explained, not with the sharp focus of negotiation, but with attention shaped by humility. Each requirement felt less like an obstacle and more like a reminder that this choice extended beyond his will. Adoption was not a declaration of capacity. It was a commitment to presence. He recognized the difference with surprising clarity. For much of his life, he had measured responsibility through control. He built systems to prevent uncertainty, resources to buffer disappointment. Here, control offered little reassurance. The girl's future could not be engineered. It would unfold through shared days, unforeseen challenges, small adjustments that resisted planning. Accepting that did not weaken his resolve, clarified its nature. He asked fewer questions than he once would have. Instead of probing for guarantees, he asked about routines, preferences, what steadied the girl when days became difficult. The staff responded with careful honesty. They did not promise transformation. They spoke of consistency, patience, and respect. Their language aligned with what had been forming quietly within him. He felt no urge to impress them. Authority in this moment seemed irrelevant. The girl watched intermittently, her gaze neither hopeful nor withdrawn. When their eyes met, There was no signal to interpret, no appeal to decode. She simply acknowledged him, as she might acknowledge weather or time passing. That neutrality felt like a gift. It removed the burden of expectation, allowing him to approach the decision without the weight of rescue or redemption. As he considered what it would mean to bring her into his life, he confronted the limits of his understanding. He did not know how she would adapt to his home, or how his world would need to change to accommodate hers. He did not know how grief might resurface for either of them, or how moments of frustration would test his patience. The unknowns no longer felt like reasons to retreat. They felt like truths to accept. He thought of his resources differently now. Wealth, influence, access, these would not define the relationship. They could provide comfort, opportunity, support, but they could not replace presence or listening. The humility in that realization grounded him. He was not choosing a future he could manage. He was choosing one he would need to enter with openness. When he finally spoke his decision, his voice was steady but unembellished. There was no sense of accomplishment in the words, no relief at having resolved a dilemma. The staff listened without reaction, their professionalism masking what might have been approval or caution. The process moved forward because it was meant to, not because of who he was. That equality steadied him further. He did not look at the girl for validation. He understood that consent in this context would be gradual, earned through reliability rather than declarations. The respect in that understanding surprised him. He had spent years commanding outcomes. Now, he committed to earning trust instead. As the paperwork began, he felt neither fear nor certainty. What he felt was alignment. The choice resonated not because it completed something missing, but because it acknowledged something real. He was not adopting to fill absence. He was adopting to share space with another life, one that existed fully without him. The girl continued her quiet routines, adjusting a book on her lap, glancing occasionally toward the window. Her life did not pivot on his decision. That truth humbled him. It reminded him that adoption was not the center of her world, only a change within it. Approaching it with that awareness felt essential. Later, as arrangements were discussed and timelines outlined, he noticed how his attention remained present rather than anticipatory. He did not imagine milestones or transformations. He imagined mornings, shared silence, learning her rhythms. The future narrowed into manageable moments rather than sweeping narratives. That shift felt healthy. When the chapter closed on that day, there was no visible transformation. No one applauded. No tears were shed. Yet something fundamental had changed. He had chosen without illusion, committed without control. The decision carried weight not because it promised fulfillment, but because it demanded humility. He left the orphanage with a quiet understanding. Whatever came next would not be shaped by certainty or mastery. It would be shaped by patience, respect, and an acceptance of what could not be fixed. In choosing that path, he did not feel triumphant. He felt grounded. The future remained open, but for the first time, he approached it without armor, ready to meet it as it was rather than as he wished it to be. The departure did not announce itself. There was no moment that separated before from after, no clear threshold crossed with ceremony. He stood near the entrance as the afternoon light softened the walls, the orphanage settling into its familiar rhythm. Shoes scuffed the floor, a distant laugh echoed. A door closed gently somewhere down the corridor. Life continued with a steadiness that felt instructive. This place did not dramatize beginnings or endings. It absorbed them quietly. He waited while final arrangements were confirmed, not with impatience but with a new attentiveness to time. For years, time had bent to his needs, measured by productivity and outcome. Here, it moved at its own pace. Waiting no longer felt like a pause, felt like participation. He noticed the smell of soap lingering in the air, the faint warmth trapped in the building from the day's sun, the way the staff moved without urgency yet without neglect. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. The girl passed him once more, guiding her wheelchair with practiced ease. She did not stop. She did not look back. There was something deeply reassuring in that independence. It confirmed what he had come to understand. This was not a rescue narrative. It was a convergence. Two lives adjusting their shapes to exist alongside each other, neither eclipsing the other. He felt the weight of what awaited him differently now. His home, once designed for solitude and efficiency, would need to soften, not remodeled into spectacle, but reoriented toward presence. He imagined quiet evenings rather than impressive gatherings, schedules built around shared routines instead of obligations. The thought did not provoke anxiety. It brought a sense of grounded anticipation, stripped of fantasy. As he thanked the staff, his words remained simple. Gratitude did not require elaboration. They responded with the same restraint they had shown throughout, offering guidance without sentimentality. Their trust was measured, conditional on consistency rather than promises. That expectation felt right. It reinforced that family was not formed through intention alone, but through sustained care. When the moment came to leave, he hesitated briefly at the door. The orphanage had changed him in ways that could not be catalogued. It had not given him answers. It had asked him better questions. He understood now that certainty was not the foundation of commitment. Willingness was the willingness to stay, to listen, to adjust when reality resisted expectation. Outside, the air felt cooler, the sky pale with late afternoon. The world beyond the orphanage seemed louder, less contained. He stood still, allowing the transition to register. This was not an escape. It was an expansion. His life was widening to include unpredictability, vulnerability, and a form of connection that could not be delegated or controlled. He thought of the household he was returning to, no longer as a structure but as a space awaiting redefinition. It would not become whole overnight. There would be moments of friction, silence, misunderstanding. But there would also be mornings shaped by routine, evenings marked by shared quiet, the gradual accumulation of trust. Family, he realized, was not an identity bestowed. It was a practice sustained. The absence of celebration felt appropriate. Joy, when it arrived, would come in smaller forms. A shared meal, a comfortable silence, the recognition of belonging that emerged slowly, without announcement. These were not milestones to be photographed or displayed. They were moments to be inhabited. As he walked away, he did not look back with longing or regret. He carried with him a sense of responsibility that felt lighter for being honest. He was not moving toward perfection. He was moving toward participation, toward a life defined less by achievement and more by presence. The girl remained inside, continuing her day without disruption. That too felt right. Her life did not revolve around his choice. It would intersect with it gradually on terms shaped by mutual respect. He welcomed that balance. It promised a future where care flowed in both directions, unburdened by obligation or debt. By the time he reached his car, the light had shifted again. The day was ending, not with resolution but with continuity. He understood that this was how beginnings often looked when stripped of performance. Quiet, unassuming, real. He started the engine, not with a sense of arrival, but with readiness. Whatever came next would not be framed by control or expectation. It would be shaped by patience, attentiveness, and the courage to remain emotionally present. That was the family he was moving toward. Not flawless, not complete, but grounded in care. And for the first time, that felt like enough.